Today's video will be a little bit different because you have already discussed diabetes pretty in depth in Block 2. So instead of focusing on just DKA and the pharmacology of DKA treatments, which are really just insulin and supportive measures, we are going to focus more on what went wrong to lead to this diabetic ketoacidotic presentation of the patient regarding his insulin regimen, compliance, and counseling. So DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis, is an acute complication generally for type 1 diabetics secondary to insulin deficiency. So briefly, what happens is without sufficient insulin, hyperglycemia results, leading to significant glycosuria, pulling fluid and electrolytes from the body, leading to dehydration, electrolyte abnormalities, and there are also significant changes in energy metabolism, because even though this patient is hyperglycemic, the body doesn't know this because there isn't any insulin to put the glucose to use in the body. So instead, the body signals as if it's in a starved or fasted state, leading to further hyperglycemia that still can't be used, ketosis, and metabolic acidosis. So DKA can be the first manifestation of a type 1 diabetic, especially in children. However, infections are one of the leading initiating events because of the stress state to fight that infection. Exacerbation of conditions that require corticosteroids like COPD or other autoimmune diseases can also trigger DKA because steroids increase glucose levels. And lastly, just inadequate insulin therapy or poor compliance can trigger DKA too. So with our patient, he reports an A1C of 7.2%, which isn't ideal. So maybe some degree of inadequate therapy or inadequate compliance. But he also reports not feeling well. However, we don't really know if he wasn't feeling well because, for instance, he might have had an infection before, or if he wasn't feeling well and he's just reporting those early signs of DKA like nausea and abdominal cramping. So the most probable option is he's just reporting early signs of DKA, and then with diarrhea and stopping his insulin because he wasn't feeling well, this has put him over the edge in terms of hyperglycemia. Regardless of the reason, the patient stopping his insulin because he wasn't feeling well and not checking his blood sugars frequently when not feeling well highlights a key counseling point that was not conveyed well to this patient. So this is really where patient resources and education can make a significant difference. So let's first touch on physiologic glucose and insulin concentrations for non-diabetics, which I believe you have seen before. So these lines will look a lot like what I'm showing you in this graph, especially if they are eating 3 meals a day, where the insulin graph follows very closely to the glucose graph, where it spikes with meals but remains steady in between meals and at night. And we need this basal insulin level so that our bodies can utilize glucose throughout the day for normal functions, and these postprandial insulin spikes to use the glucose from food to be stored for later or used immediately and avoid hyperglycemic episodes. Now, type 1 diabetics are insulin deficient and need to be supplied insulin in a way that will mimic both the basal and postprandial insulin in this graph to ensure proper glucose utilization and prevent hyperglycemia and resulting DKA. So what the patient understood was that in order to avoid hypoglycemia, because he wasn't eating, he needed to adjust his insulin regimen. But it's likely he didn't realize that he needs some insulin even if he isn't eating for that maintenance glucose use. And that this has to be coupled with close blood glucose monitoring, because if you have an infection, for instance, your blood glucose may still be climbing even if you don't feel like eating, in which case you would need more insulin than what this patient was giving himself. So generally a good strategy for those not eating is to either start by cutting their insulin dose in half, or if you skip a meal, skip that mealtime insulin dose and then check glucose levels frequently, and if high, just supplement with more insulin if necessary. So now that we've discussed what went wrong and the patient education that could have avoided this incidence of DKA, let's talk more about these insulin types and regimens to provide more context to this patient education. So if we move to the next slide. So first, let's discuss and compare insulin pharmacodynamics, because this is what distinguishes all the insulins you probably came across in Block 2. So first, for comparison's sake, we have endogenous insulin, which will be the quickest on-off switch. And this peak is really what we are trying to mimic with mealtime insulin. So when I say mealtime insulin, we want it to be able to handle that postprandial glucose spike. So rapid-acting insulins will be the insulins most closely mimicking physiologic insulin release following a meal, where their onset of action is about 15 minutes, they peak at about an hour, and then they last around 3 to 5 hours or so. These would be insulin lispro, glulisine, and aspart. So our next option for mealtime insulin is regular insulin, which takes about 30 minutes to an hour to start working. It peaks at about 2 to 4 hours and can last up to about 6 hours. Now, patients will have less flexibility with this short-acting insulin, and will really have to plan their meals and insulin doses out accordingly to ensure the insulin is given at the right time with sufficient time before a meal. Otherwise, the patient will experience dips and spikes in their blood glucose levels. Now, moving into our intermediate insulin, which is known as NPH, and this can fit the role of basal insulin, but it is not the best option necessarily for this. So NPH has an onset of about 2 to 4 hours, a peak at 8 hours, and then it lasts normally about 14 to 20 hours. So remember, under normal conditions, we always have a steady level of basal insulin. But with NPH, we are not going to be covering the full 24-hour window with a single dose, and will likely require 2 doses. So 2 injections in addition to mealtime insulin to cover the day. So to circumvent this, we have long-acting insulins like insulin glargine, detamir, and degludec, which have an onset of about 1 to 2 hours and don't really have a peak. But sometimes you might see one listed at 8 hours or so. And this can cover the entire day with a duration of 24 to 30 hours, and in the case of insulin degludec, up to 42 hours. And these long-acting agents are ideal for basal insulin roles. So moving to the next slide. So you may be thinking, why would patients ever opt for anything besides rapid-acting insulin to cover meals and long-acting insulin to cover basal insulin needs? Well, the answer is cost and number of injections. So first, cost. So the long-acting and the rapid-acting insulins can be very expensive, even with insurance. And for those individuals without insurance, it can be impossible to afford. However, regular insulin, or the short-acting insulin, and NPH, or the intermediate insulin, are much cheaper and available over the counter. Additionally, there are pre-mixed insulins available that are over the counter or prescription that include this regular and NPH in a single vial. So that means only 1 copay for 1 vial of medication versus 2 copays, 1 for each type of insulin. So despite the clear pharmacological advantages of rapid and long-acting insulins, regular insulin and NPH insulin, or their premixed forms, are still seen today. So moving to the next slide. So the next consideration is number of injections, which brings us to one of the key topics of this video, being how are these insulins combined to mimic a physiologic insulin regimen? So if you recall, this is what insulin concentrations would look like over the course of a day for a non-diabetic eating 3 meals a day. So if cost and number of injections weren't a concern, pharmacologically, what would make the most sense would be rapid-acting insulin that would be given between 15 minutes before or immediately following a meal, along with a long-acting insulin at bedtime. So for individuals opting for this basal and rapid insulin combination, they cannot be mixed together. So they're looking at a minimum of 4 injections a day, assuming they are eating 3 meals. So depending on the patient's ability to actually give themselves injections or do their work schedule or for a number of other reasons, 4 injections may not be doable. So this graph is going to look a little bit different if the patient is opting for regular insulin at meals and NPH insulin to cover their basal. But regardless, they are still going to require 4 injections if the regular insulin and the NPH are separate. So moving to the next slide. So you'll notice 2 slides ago that there's actually one line on the graph we haven't discussed yet, and those are the pre-mixed insulins. As I mentioned before, there are pre-mixes of insulins available, and regular and NPH combined together in a single vial are generally a cheaper option for patients. However, they are generally dosed twice daily. And their curves will look a lot like this. And this is really just based on the pharmacodynamics of that mixture of the short-acting insulin and the intermediate-acting insulin and the risk for hypoglycemia. However, you'll notice that this is not nicely going to mimic that normal physiologic release of insulin. But it's still going to provide some level of basal and meal coverage to some degree, and again would be a much cheaper option because 1 bottle of insulin means 1 copay, and this would only require 2 injections per day, which may be a better option for patients that are unable to do 4 injections. However, this option would require significant counseling on diet and glucose monitoring to ensure adequate control. There are also premixed versions of the rapid insulins Lispro and Aspart, where these peaks would be a little bit sharper, and they are basically the original rapid insulin mixed with the same rapid insulin, but it has now been modified to be a slow release. And this would also only require twice daily dosing. But again, it's not going to perfectly mimic that ideal insulin graph. Now, another alternative that I'm not going to draw out for you, but I just want you to be aware of, is that NPH insulin can be drawn up and mixed in the same syringe as many rapid and the short-acting regular insulin. Again, this would be able to reduce the number of injections to potentially 2 or 3 a day, but again, at that expense of mimicking physiology. So moving to the next slide. So I hope this video has provided some clarity with regard to the types of insulin and insulin regimens and how patient education is incredibly important for type 1 diabetics because they really rely on insulin for survival. But remember, there are just so many options and considerations when it comes to picking an insulin regimen, and as I have showed you, one size does not fit all. So in order to identify the best option, these conversations have to be had with patients because this is a real commitment with severe consequences if there are any misunderstandings, like in the case of our patient with DKA.